In this video, we're going to talk about the early republic, specifically the Washington and Adams administration. With this new constitution, they have this awesome responsibility of setting new precedents to the presidency. And so we're going to look at how exactly that's done. There's also some video clips after this from other sources that I recommend that will be extremely helpful to you. Okay, so first we'll talk about Washington himself. He becomes president in 1789. The Constitution itself is ratified the year before. So there's an election, and he is unanimously elected by the electors. The runner-up, and the way they had it established at that time, was that the runner-up became vice president. I know, super awkward to think about that today if we still had that. That changes with the 12th Amendment. But Washington himself establishes a lot of precedents. In other words, he knew he had this awesome responsibility to set the stage for how other presidencies will be run. So he establishes something known as a cabinet, which we still have today, and we have a lot of these cabinet places still today. Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton was the Treasury. Secretary of War, that we call the Secretary of Defense today, was Henry Knox. And our first Chief Justice is John Jay. Those of you who went to a Northside school, you know that all of the high schools were named after Supreme Court justices, and that's where John Jay High School gets their name from. But anyway, the idea of a cabinet shouldn't surprise you if you know the character of George Washington. He was a very good person about surrounding himself with people who were experts in the field. That's obviously a great sign of a leader, but Washington himself really knew that he needed to do that in order to really have a successful country. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that a president has to have a cabinet, but this is something that's become tradition because it's a precedent that Washington himself set. So Hamilton's financial plan, Alexander Hamilton was the very first Secretary of Treasury, and he establishes something called his 5-part financial plan. He knew that in order for America to become a country that's taken seriously, we needed to pay off our debt. We were in an enormous amount of debt because of the Revolutionary War. So he wants to establish credit so that if we need to borrow money from other countries in the future, we will have established some kind of credit. He also creates, very controversially, a national bank, and this was to help pay off that debt, but also to make loans, especially to the North, for entrepreneurs so the country could grow. He wants to issue a whiskey tax. That's also going to become controversial, that we'll talk about, and the creation of a tariff. Okay, and if you know anything about a tariff is a tax on an imported good. So Hamilton established this for 2 reasons. Number one, because he wants to bring money in to pay off the debt, right? And to have the country function. But the other reason is because he wanted people to buy American goods. Okay, and that's still around today, the whole idea of a tariff. And so he establishes that so that the price of the export or the imports, the foreign goods, would unrealistically look higher than the American goods. And so people would prefer to buy that. And we're going to talk about, why it is that people were upset about that. Okay, so although most of Hamilton's plans do get passed, there are some concerns over the plan itself. The first is the tariff. Okay, a lot of people in the South, in particular the farmers, felt like, well, when we export goods, if we're taxing the goods coming in, then countries are going to tax us, and we're not going to be able to export as much, which is true. They're also concerned about being consumers. Now they're paying higher prices for goods that had lower prices before. The whiskey tax, a lot of people felt that this unfairly singles out the grain farmers that you make whiskey with. We're going to see an uprising in Pennsylvania because of this. And the bank itself was probably the most controversial aspect because for a couple reasons. The people in the South felt like that unfairly helps the people in the North. It wasn't a state-by-state bank. It was done nationally, and they were favoring the people in the North. And also the other critics of it said that there's nothing in the Constitution that says Congress can create a bank. Hamilton knows this, okay, and he says that there is a clause in the Constitution known as the Necessary and Proper Clause, also the Elastic Clause, for obvious reasons, saying that the Congress could do anything that was necessary and proper to run the country. And so he uses that to create the national bank. So how does this happen? And here's some critics and supporters. Okay, the people that supported his financial plan are obviously financiers, merchants, and manufacturers, people that believed that the strength to the United States came from commercial power. The critics are mainly James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. They felt that the future of the United States lay with farmers and agrarian type society, and westward expansion was the key to that. They envisioned this like republic of farmers and agrarian people. And how this finally gets pushed through is that Jefferson and Hamilton came together to make the bank happen. And the only way Jefferson would approve this is if they agreed to put a national capital inside of the southern part of the United States, in between, Maryland and Virginia, Washington, D.C. You may have not known that actually Washington himself never lived in Washington, D.C. The first president to live there was actually John Adams, who was the second president. But this happens when they create, the Washington, D.C. and the whole plans of it, and you can see how that's laid out over here. Okay, so just like I mentioned, the Whiskey Rebellion itself in 1791, I'll kind of move that so you can see that there. But this happens in reaction to the whiskey tax itself. So backcountry, meaning the western part of the state of Pennsylvania, that's where a lot of grain farmers were. Washington, in response to this rebellion that begins to happen, this rebellion of whiskey farmers, he dispatches, and he actually goes himself and leads the charge of 13,000 troops to put down a few hundred of this rebellion. So the farmers are like, oh my God, I can't believe that Washington sent all these people. But also, so they stand down. They don't try to resist really. But what this does, and the reason that Washington does this in a lot of ways, is to show the strength of this national government and this new Constitution. Because years prior, in 1786 and 87, there was a farmer uprising in Massachusetts called Shays' Rebellion that almost overthrew the entire government itself, and actually overthrew the Massachusetts Supreme Court. And they had no federal government to help with this because of the Articles of Confederation were in place then. And so this was, in addition to putting down a rebellion, it was a way to kind of flex the power of the new Constitution, and for lack of a better term these days. Okay, the other thing that happens is that the French Revolution happens in Europe. So remember that the French helped us during the Revolution. And a lot of people, the burgesses in France, they get inspiration from the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution, and they want to throw out the monarch. Okay, and so they do that, and they launch a rebellion. And in 1793, the rebellion takes a very ugly turn that's known as the Reign of Terror, in which they chop off the heads of, the aristocrats, in particular, King Louis and Marie Antoinette. Now, Jefferson and his followers, and Jefferson is in love with France. He loves France, and he's always supported it. He supports France and supports their cause, not necessarily brutality, but on the other hand, John Adams, Hamilton, and Washington don't support it. They thought it symbolized anarchy, and they also saw their loyalty to King Louis because it was under his government that helped helped us during the American Revolution. And so it's going to be a little bit complex between what they agree with there. So with that, war, the rise of Napoleon after the French Revolution. So Napoleon rises to power in France shortly after the French. So they go from like a monarchy to almost a dictator. But he leads a war between France and Great Britain. So all of a sudden, America is now in between France and Great Britain in this feud between them. Okay, Washington absolutely wants nothing to do with this at all. He issues a neutrality proclamation in 1793 to avoid, specifically stating he wants to avoid any kind of involvement in either. Doesn't want to support Great Britain. He doesn't want to support France. He wants to stay out of it. He thinks that we're too young of a country to get involved, and frankly, he doesn't necessarily support either side. The British and the French, though, both feel like America owes them and wants America to help them, and in retaliation, they both do something called impressment. So impressment was the forcible seizing of an American merchant ships and kidnapping the people, the merchants that are on that ship, and forcing them into their navy, so the French Navy or the British Navy. Now, obviously, this very much upsets the Americans, and George Washington himself sets off to try to stop this kind of impressment and abuse by both the British and the French. Okay. So the first person that George Washington sends to try to broker a deal with is John Jay, the Supreme Court Justice. So he sends John Jay to negotiate a peace treaty with Great Britain, and he does this because of the impressments, but also because there's a lot of British soldiers still in forts in the western part of the United States at that time, which is right along the Mississippi River. And so he sends people there, Jay there, to negotiate the removal of British troops and also to stop the impressment. When Jay comes back, he comes back with a really crappy treaty that people were very upset with. There's no language in the treaty at all that said that they were going to stop the impressments. And the only way the British were going to remove troops was if America gave a favorable trading status to Great Britain for their imported goods. On top of all this, the French get very, very offended that we negotiated a treaty with Great Britain and we didn't initiate one with France. Not to say that wasn't in the mind of Washington, but that isn't the first place that he went. So this upsets and further strains our relationship with France. Because of all of these things happening, the bank and the disputes with that, and the disputes over what's happening in Europe, we see for the very first time political parties form. These two political parties were known as the Federalists, and really they're more often referred to as the Democratic Republicans, although you might see them referred to as the Republicans in some spots. Hamilton, Adams, and probably Washington, although he never liked to be classified as any political party, were really part of these Federalists. So this name obviously comes from the Federalists versus Anti-Federalists from the debate with the Constitution. But one key thing, Madison was a Federalist during the Federalist, Anti-Federalist Constitution ratification. But he becomes a Democratic Republican with Jefferson, and there's some reasons why for this. But the Federalists themselves, favor Great Britain. They're more elitist, so they lead more to the rich and well-born. They believe that the commercial side is the key to American growth. On the opposite end, the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, are more sympathetic to France and their plight. They focus more on farmers and this agrarian type thing, and they're also very critical of the elitist nature of the Federalist political party. Okay, so Washington does a very interesting thing. Washington, although there's nothing in the Constitution at that time that says that presidents only have to serve 2 terms, he sets a precedent that every president should step down after 2 terms. And so he establishes this mainly because he feels like we should steer away from anything that remotely looks like a monarchy. And he does a farewell address that's actually printed. It's not like the farewell addresses or the speeches that we see today that, there wasn't a way to gather people together or anything like that. So they would write these kinds of speeches and publish them in the newspaper. It's pretty well known that Hamilton actually wrote this for him, but definitely Washington's sentiments and words that were in it. In the farewell address, he says some things. Number 1, he says the Constitution works. Okay, let's let this Constitution work. It's great. He warns the country against a few key things. Foreign alliances. He says, don't make foreign alliances with other countries. Political parties will be the downfall of our country. Stay out of debt. Okay, and he predicts that a civil war might erupt because of the regional differences that are beginning to form. it almost makes you think that maybe Congress and the rest of the political leaders should read the farewell address on a yearly basis, right? Because we've basically failed at all of these things. But anyway, so the next president is John Adams. He runs against Thomas Jefferson. And remember, at this point, the runner-up is still going to be the vice president, and that's Thomas Jefferson. When Adams becomes president, he's still having the issue of France and Great Britain seizing American ships, but he understands that France is upset about this whole issue of not creating, an alliance or a treaty with them that we did with Great Britain with Jay's Treaty. And so he sends 3 diplomats to France to negotiate this treaty. And there's actually a really cute video that I'm going to include in here too, the XYZ affair. It's a cartoon, but it's great, and it's just kind of cool. And it really explains it pretty well. But anyway, what happens is that he sends 3 representatives from America to go to Great Britain to negotiate a treaty with them. He's met by 3 people who were never identified, so they refer to them as X, Y, and Z. And the 3 people said, if you want a treaty with us, you're going to have to give us a bribe. So the American diplomats were very offended by this. Okay, they say no, and they leave, and they report this back to America. When they come back and they tell Adams this and the rest of America, everybody is completely offended by this, and we enter into years of what's known as a quasi-war with France. Quasi-war meaning it wasn't officially determined, but there was definitely skirmishes, violent skirmishes and battles between France and America during that time. But it does have kind of a reaction, in addition to that, of something known as the Alien and Sedition Acts, which will be the downfall of Adams and the reason why he was only a 1-term president. So unfortunately, he and the other Federalists passed something known as the Alien Acts and something known as the Sedition Acts. So they began to deport people that had French sympathies or they deemed dangerous. Those were known as the Alien Acts. And they also, and this is the more critical one, passed something called the Sedition Act, in which if anybody spoke out against Adams or the Federalists, they could jail them. Okay? So like I said, this becomes a complete downfall of not just Adams. So Adams doesn't win the next election. Thomas Jefferson does. But it's also the downfall of the Federalists. The Federalists die out because of these Alien and Sedition Acts. So they had quite the effect to them. Okay? The other thing, and this one becomes kind of dangerous, but nobody really knows or thinks about them because they're so embarrassed about the Alien and Sedition Acts. So Thomas Jefferson and James Madison passed something called the Kentucky and Virginia Resolutions. Jefferson went into the Kentucky state legislature and passes the Kentucky resolutions. Madison goes into Virginia and passes the Virginia resolutions. Both of them essentially stated that they're not going to follow the Alien and Sedition Acts that were passed by Congress because they declared them unconstitutional by the First Amendment. Now, everybody just kind of lets the Alien and Sedition Acts die out quietly, but this sets a dangerous precedent later on in the Civil War. And what it says is that a state government could nullify any laws they deem unconstitutional. The South is going to use the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions later on as justification to secede from the Union. Okay, so keep this kind of in the back of your mind. But that's really it. That leads us right to 1800, and we're going to talk about the antebellum era and the reform movements next time. But that should give you a little bit of background. Okay, hope you guys have a wonderful day, and that was helpful.